whose authority in the art world is, of course, infamous and famous. A director of the National Portrait Gallery, National Gallery, Chief Executive of the Royal Academy of Arts. We are extremely fortunate to welcome Charles here today. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this talk. Over to you.
Well, thank you all for coming. What I'm going to do just is to start informally saying what I am doing and, more important, what I'm not doing. Just because when I gave the title, I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be and how it was going to turn out. So about a year and a half ago, in March last year, I published a book called The Art Museum in Modern Times. And it's mainly about big public museums, but it does include some private institutions. And I thought, because we're in a small private art gallery, rather than talking about the book as a whole, I would talk about the private institutions. So I've done what I'm afraid is rather a formal talk about 5 key post-war private galleries with illustrations. I take the illustrations, I'm afraid, from Google. So some are all right, but some are a bit fuzzy. And that's just because it's very convenient. I mean, it's actually, to be honest, I did the illustrations for the book, except then there was a nice person at Thames and Hudson who made sure that they were properly reproduced and of the finest quality. But if you take them from Google, some are fine, and some of them are a bit fuzzy. So Nicholas' original suggestion was that I would speak about my book, The Art Museum in Modern Times, published in March last year, and which I'm pleased to say is stocked in the bookshop downstairs. Here's the cover of the book, and here's a picture I took last time I was here of the bookshop, where you can spot it on the second from bottom. At the time she asked me a couple of months ago, I'd just been invited to have lunch with someone who's planning to open a private gallery. And so I was thinking about 2 things in particular. The first was that although my book deals with plenty of private museums and galleries, and indeed this was one of the themes that I tried to bring out in the final section of the book, I tended to focus on the larger and more internationally well-known museums like the Museum of Modern Art, Guggenheim Museum in New York, Tate Modern in London. So I left out at least 2 very significant smaller private institutions, one of them being Heidi Museum of Modern Art outside Melbourne, and one that I'm afraid I particularly regret not having included, and that's Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, which in retrospect I feel I should have included. The second thing I was thinking about in connection with the lunch I had was the psychology of the private collector. What is it that makes a collector want to establish a small private gallery rather than give works of art to add to the collection of a public institution? So, as I've said, instead of talking about the subject of my book as a whole, which is in any case available to read, I thought I would focus this morning on one strand of the book only, the rise of the private gallery, and try to think through some of the answers to this question about the psychology of the private collector by looking at the history of a small number of the private galleries established in the last 80 years or so, 5 in particular, how they've come about, and what they can tell us about the nature and character of the private collector, their aims and aspirations, and what they might have in common besides their wealth. I thought I'd start with Louisiana outside Copenhagen, because for many people, including me, it's the model of the private gallery. Its story is pretty well documented, and I've told some of the story in the book. The hero of the story is the person who established the museum, who was called Knut Jensen. There he is That looks to me a particularly fuzzy picture. He was a remarkable and interesting person who inherited a profitable dairy business. But as sometimes happens with second, and as he was particularly third generation businessman, he found he was more interested in art and literature than he was in just making money. This is the portrait which I reproduce in the book. Here he is dressed casually, probably his style, confronting the camera very slightly combatively. It's probably also his style, I suspect. I don't know what date the photograph was taken, but it was probably sometime in the late 50s or early 60s, by which time he had already opened the museum, of which he was also the director. I show another picture of him when he was a bit older. And I think from the photographs you get a feel of what he was like, his personality. Robustly independent-minded, and I suspect more than a bit contemptuous of traditional ways of doing things. He described what happened to persuade him to open his own museum in an article published in the New Yorker in 1982. He'd been asked in an interview what he thought about the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Copenhagen. I assume they were thinking of Copenhagen's National Gallery. This is what he said. I hadn't particularly thought about the Royal Museum in some time. I guess I just took it for granted. But prior to the interview, I went over to take a look with fresh spectacles. And I was dumbfounded. It was a true horror cabinet. Very much the 19th century bourgeoisie's exaggerated view of its own importance, manifested in the transcendent value of the art it prized. It was a real art temple, huge fat columns, a broad forbidding marble staircase, rows and rows of plaster busts, dark alcoves. During the interview, I therefore started criticizing the museum, saying that it was a relic and had nothing to do with the art of our time. So what do you propose, the journalist demanded. Well, just improvising. I suggested that they ought to move out into the museum's large park, get a good architect, build a low pavilion with not too high ceilings and good lighting, and move all the modern stuff out there. This is, I guess, a classic description of what made people in the post-war period want to build their own museum, and it's certainly a good description of Jensen's own motivation. He thought that traditional museums were too formal, too forbidding, and too didactic. He wanted something a bit more informal and less imposing. Sometime after the interview, he sold his dairy business to Kraft, and he decided to use the money to build his own gallery next to the sea in the grounds of an old house near where he lived in the country north of Copenhagen. Actually, I'll show the house in a minute. I thought it was the next image. He commissioned two architects. So here are the two architects. One was Wilhelm Volha, who was almost exactly the same age as Jensen, born in 1920, educated at the Royal Danish Academy, been a visiting professor at the University of Berkeley, California in the early 1950s. The other was called Jürgen Boe. Here they are, leaning against the brick wall of the newly constructed library at Louisiana. Two young Danish architects, both modernists, who had just completed a very thoughtful new style of museum. So what was and is special about Louisiana? That's the house. The best way of getting a feel for it at the time that it opened is to look at the photographs which were taken of it at the time by a photographer called Jesper Holm. Here's the old house which Jensen bought at the entrance to his museum. It's planned to stretch out beyond it. This is the terrace, which looks out over the sea, where visitors could relax, have a cup of coffee. This is one of the corridors, tiled floors, you see, relatively low wooden ceiling, views out onto the garden. Here's one of the galleries looking out onto the lake. And here's another of the galleries. So you get a feel for what was, in many ways, the prototype of the post-war private gallery. What I hope these images give you is a sense of how revolutionary Louisiana was at its time, providing a way of looking at art which was more casual, domestic, and informal, part of a day visit intended for pure pleasure, and not in any way didactic. So the second of the institutions I'm going to focus on this morning is Catholicism in Cambridge. I think I was anxious that the book shouldn't feel too Anglocentric, and I maybe took Catholicism a bit too much for granted. I thought of it as much as a private house as a public gallery, which in retrospect was probably a mistake, because I think it is important in itself and also on the influence it's had on art historians, including, perhaps most importantly, Nick Sirota, who cites it as an important influence on his attitude to the appropriate display of art. So I'm going to start by looking at the background to the creation of Catholicism. Jim Eade, who created it, came of a pretty well-to-do family. He was sent to boarding school in Cambridge, the Perth School, where he got interested in early Italian art. Then he went as an art student to the Newlands Art School in Cornwall and briefly Edinburgh College of Art, where he trained as a painter. After service in the First World War, he went back to the Slade School of Art, got a job as a photographer's assistant at the National Gallery in 1921, moving to work at the Tate the following year. In 1923, he made friends with the young artists Ben and Winifred Nicholson. He moved up to Hampstead, where he and his wife, Helen, entertained many of the young artists of the time. I'll show a photograph of him, taken by Ottilie Morel in 1930. You see him in the middle. He's presumably, it's at Garsington Manor, which was Ottilie Morel's house just east of Oxford, together with, as you see from the labels, Arthur Whaley on the left, who had recently left a post at the British Museum so he could spend more time skiing, and Walter Cresswell, who's down on the right, who was a New Zealander trying to make a living as a poet. In 1936, Eade was regarded as a leading candidate to become director of the Tate, a post for which I think he would have been pretty well qualified given his immense knowledge of contemporary art. But he seems to have had something of a nervous breakdown. He and his wife moved instead to Tangiers. Here's a picture of him in Tangiers, and he himself designed a white modernist house for them called White Stone. After the war, the Eades moved briefly to a farmhouse near Blois in the Loire Valley, and then in 1956 they bought some dilapidated cottages not far from the centre of Cambridge, incredibly dilapidated, up the road from Magdalen College and next to St. Peter's Church. They restored them following the principles of design which Eade had developed, placing a great deal of emphasis on good natural daylight and simplicity of layout, a modernist aesthetic in which everything had its place and was very carefully and artfully arranged, including bits of wood they had picked up on the beaches of Tangier and stones. Jim Eade explained his plans in a letter to his friend, the artist David Jones. It would be very interesting to be lent a great house on the verge of a city or in a place of great beauty in a town, Cambridge I have in mind, and make it all I could of lived-in beauty, each room an atmosphere of quiet and simple charm, and open to the public, in Cambridge for students especially. And for such a living creation, I would give all that I have in pictures and lovely objects. 10 years later, the Eads decided to donate both their house and its collection to the University of Cambridge as a place where students in particular could enjoy the experience of living with and experiencing works of art in domestic surroundings. He obviously felt it was more important to live with art in a natural environment, surrounded by furniture and objects, than it was to study art in a museum environment. He liked to entertain students to tea, and he had a lending library so that they could borrow works of art for their rooms. So this, I don't know if you can read it, it's a little advert with a picture of the cottages and an invitation, painting, sculpture, drawings. Undergraduates are welcome to call every day, including Sundays, between 2 and 4 p.m. So there he was, sitting, offering them cups of tea and willing to lend them his paintings if they wanted to hang them in their rooms. Now, I've tried to find photographs of the inside of the house as it was when it was first laid out. It turned out to be slightly harder than I expected, but I did find, actually I've left out, this is a slightly more sophisticated, you know, the first one is very amateurish, handwritten, and this is when it's become slightly more of a formal thing. The first picture I found was of Jim Eade himself getting up from a chair at his desk, which gives you, I think, something of the atmosphere of the house. Actually, as I look round, here we are. Deliberately puritanical, oak floorboards, everywhere about the look of things with a cultivated and high-minded, partly spiritual austerity. Then Catholicism very kindly sent me some illustrations from his book, A Way of Life, which actually has now been reproduced. It's expensive, but it gives you a lot about his philosophy. He published the book in 1984, and the photographs obviously give a much better idea of the interiors as they were originally laid out. So here you see some old furniture, some new carpets, this emphasis on good quality natural daylight. That's his rather austere bedroom. Eventually, well, not eventually, he kind of ran it himself, I think, till 1982, and then he, 72, then he moved up to Edinburgh. Died, I think, in 82. Now, in 1970, an extension was added by Leslie Martin, who was then the Professor of Architecture at Cambridge, jointly with somebody, I think I couldn't find out much about him. It's called David Owers, who was a partner in Leslie Martin's office. Like Martin, taught at the Cambridge School of Architecture. So that's the last, I think, of the images of the private part of the house. And then this is the extension to the right. It's good. I mean, Leslie Martin was very modernist, but because it was immediately next door to the brick house, it's done in quite a low-key way. That's an early image of what the galleries looked like, which I think gives a sense of the contrast between the original interiors of the house and the slightly more public feel of the extension, which is kind of half a house, half a museum. So now, the third of my case studies of people who decided to establish private museums in the post-war period rather than give their collections to establish public museums is Robert and Lisa Sainsbury. Robert Sainsbury, or Bob Sainsbury as he was known, was one of the people who, together with his older brother Alan, was responsible for the post-war expansion of Sainsbury's the supermarkets. Alan was responsible for the shops, and Bob for the finance and administration. Here's a picture of Bob Sainsbury in a photograph taken by Godfrey Argent, who was the photographer who did photographs for the National Portrait Gallery in 1969, which was the year that he retired as the supermarket's chairman. It's a rather fine photograph. 1937, he married a second cousin of his called Lisa Vandenberg. I never met him, but I certainly met Lisa, who was a quite formidable figure. They were passionate and knowledgeable collectors of both contemporary art and what they called primitive art, Oceanic art, African art, art from the Americas, which they were able to acquire relatively cheaply in the period immediately after the war, either from dealers in Paris, or they had a London dealer called John Hewitt. Bob Sainsbury set up an account for which to buy art. From 1946 to 1953, it was £1,000 a year, increased in 1953 to 2,000. I mean, it's interesting. 2,000 was a lot of money, of course, in the early 50s, but still, it was, not gigantic amounts. With these relatively small sums, they were able to acquire a simply amazing collection, including the work of Picasso, Giacometti, and Francis Bacon. Here's Francis Bacon's portrait of Bob Sainsbury, not really recognisable, painted in 1955 at Bacon's studio. They made friends with both Bacon and also Giacometti. In 1969, following Bob Sainsbury's retirement from the supermarket, they began to think what they should do with their collection. He was actually chairman of the Tate at the time, but they wanted to keep the collection intact, and it was much too wide-ranging for the Tate. They offered it first to the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, but interestingly, the Fitzwilliams said they would split the collection, keeping all the European work in the Fitzwilliam Museum and the work from other parts of the world in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in a different part of the town. Luckily, they had made friends with someone called Frank Thistlethwaite, who was the first Vice-Chancellor of the University of East Anglia, and Thistlethwaite persuaded them to donate their collection to the university as a resource for students. There's a picture of Frank Thistlethwaite on the occasion of the announcement of the gift. Now, as you might have guessed, Bob Sainsbury was not the type of person to delegate the choice of architect to the university. He immediately embarked on finding out about the work of young architects to design a gallery to house the collection on the University of East Anglia's campus outside Norwich. He saw and admired a passenger terminal which had been designed on the Isle of Dogs by the young Norman Foster. I mean, this was pretty much Norman Foster's first work. I think the truth is that Bob Sainsbury was very interested in open plan offices. So that's why he was struck by this. He liked its lightweight construction, the sense of modernity, and particularly the open plan of the offices. So he commissioned Norman Foster to design an open plan gallery for them, which was essentially a lightweight shed, equivalent in style and design to the Olsen Centre. It's a version, I think, of a supermarket for the display of contemporary art, a more democratic way. When I reread that this morning, I thought it sounded slightly rude, but it's not intended to be. I think it was genuinely this idea of having somewhere which was more democratic, which you could go into and see everything on display. A more democratic way of displaying it than the hierarchies of a traditional museum. So this is one of Norman Foster's early designs for it. Lightweight, open to the landscape, almost certainly influenced by Louisiana and belonging to something of the same aesthetic as Kettle's Yard. So it's more about aesthetic experience looking at art than it is about studying it. I showed an interesting watercolour of people sitting reading in the mezzanine. I think a lot of it was about not kind of going around it as a museum, but living in it, living with it. And it's integrated with the History of Art department. Famously, he put the locks to the doors at the bottom of the doors, much to the irritation of all the art historians of that generation. And then I show you an image of the interior as it was when the building first opened in 1978. So I hope by now you're beginning to get a picture of the sorts of motives which lay behind the creation of private museums and galleries. We've looked at two very independent-minded industrialists who chose to house their collection outside the city in buildings which were much more informal and casual than the traditional museum. Both Jim Eade and Bob Sainsbury were interested in the impact their art would have on young people. They wanted people to enjoy the experience of living with art, a different experience from looking at works of art more historically in a museum. So I'm now going to go to the other side of the globe and look at the circumstances which led to the establishment of the Heidi Museum of Art outside Melbourne. Because again, this is one of the institutions which I feel I should maybe have included in the book, but didn't. Robert, you've probably been to Heidi. How many people have been to Heidi?
I haven't.
Okay, I mean, I didn't include it partly because I haven't been there recently, so that I only have a memory of it, but it made quite a big impression on me. John and Sunday Reed, who built it, shared many of the same characteristics of the other people I've been looking at. John Reed came from a well-to-do evangelical Tasmanian family. He went to boarding school in Australia during the First World War, and then to Cambridge, where he studied law, returning to Australia, where he worked in a law firm. But at the same time, he made friends with artists. So you begin to get a sense of the pattern that they're all pretty much the same generation, which is not really a surprise. In 1932, he married Sunday Baillieu, who also came from a wealthy family and had already been married and divorced. Here's a picture of them at their wedding. Sunday Reed was spectacularly unfaithful to him. They bought a farmhouse northeast of Melbourne near a town called Heidelberg. They christened it Heidi, making it into a centre for artists, at least two of whom Sunday Reed fell in love with. One of them being Sidney Nolan, who did his great series of paintings of Ned Kelly while living at Heidi during the Second World War. This is a picture next of what was called Heidi 1, Tiny, the original farmhouse where they lived a pretty bohemian life. In 1938, they established the Contemporary Art Society, and in 1958, they transformed the Contemporary Art Society's gallery in Melbourne into a new museum of modern art and design, modelled on the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 1963, they commissioned an architect, David McGlashan, to design what was known as Heidi 2. Here's Heidi 2, slightly different in style, a more modernist construction, but still a building in which they expected to live, surrounded by their collection. So that's it from outside. This is its interior. It's very characteristic of its period, double height, a place in which to show off their art as well as a place to live in. In the early 1980s, they donated Heidi 2 and its collection to the state government of Victoria. It opened in November 1981. John Reed died on the 5th of December 1981, and Sunday Reed 10 days later. Their house, their collection, and their support of contemporary art was absolutely central to the development of modern art in Australia and attitudes towards modern art during the 1950s. Public museums are perhaps inevitably more conservative. So my fifth and final case study of the circumstances which led private individuals to establish a private museum instead of donating their collection to a public gallery is the de Meniels in Houston, Texas, where the de Meniels decided to establish their own private museum in the suburbs of the city, instead of giving their collection, which they so easily could have done, to the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, of which Jean de Meniel was a very active trustee. You will by now recognise that they shared many of the characteristics of the other four collectors that we've been looking at. Jean de Meniel was an essentially self-made oil tycoon, although he came from a very aristocratic French family. Started life as a banker. In 1931, he met and married Dominique Schlumberger, a young, smart heiress to a fortune based on the development of the electrical equipment which was able to detect whether or not oil was below ground. Her father, Conrad Schlumberger, and his younger brother, Paul, had established the Société de Protection Électrique in 1926. So I show you Jean and Dominique de Meniel at their wedding. And then in 1938, Jean joined the Schlumberger family firm. And he worked initially, just before the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, in Bucharest. And then from 1941, he was made president of Schlumberger Overseas and Schlumberger Surenco, which was their South American division, based in New York. They moved to New York, where they were deeply influenced by a Dominican priest, Father Couturier, who trained as a painter and was interested in the nature of the relationship between art and religion, editing a journal called L'Art Sacré. In 1942, they moved to Houston, and Jean, who anglicised his name to John, began to collect paintings on his trips to New York. Initially, a small Cézanne watercolour, but later more abstract work. In 1948, they commissioned Philip Johnson, one of the leading post-war American architects, to design a house for them in River Oaks. There's what little you can see of their house in River Oaks. I've not been. But the house was a statement of their belief in modernism, and it became the base for their activities as patrons, collectors, and also, it's worth saying, supporters of the civil rights movement. In 1954, they founded the Meniel Foundation, dedicated to the support and advancement of religious, charitable, literary, scientific, and educational purposes. They were involved in promoting the study of contemporary art, as well as collecting it. Sorry, I've by mistake gone on to the next slide. Actually, I can now go on to the next slide. This is Dominique de Meniel with Magritte, weirdly. It's Magritte in the cowboy hat at a rodeo outside Houston in 1965. I mean, they invited people to stay, and they entertained them, and people had a nice time, including, we hope, Magritte. In 1970, they decided to commission a building for their collection by Louis Kahn, the great architect, after hearing him speak at the Museum of Fine Art. Kahn produced an absurdly overambitious project, which the de Meniels thought was impractical, and not long afterwards, Jean de Meniel was diagnosed with cancer. In 1971, they opened the Rosco Chapel, a place for meditative ecumenical contemplation, a great and very important building. I mean, there's a sort of quasi-religious spiritual aspect. Certainly, I think Jim Eade and David Jones were interested in this kind of connection between art and religion, and so, obviously, were the de Meniels. John de Meniel died in 1973, and so in the same year did Louis Kahn. As a result of John de Meniel's death, it was left to Dominique to fulfill their aspirations to create a gallery for their collection. In 1980, Pontus Hultén, the first director of the Centre Pompidou, persuaded her that Renzo Piano would be the best architect to talk to, even though she actually hated the Centre Pompidou. Here's a picture of Renzo Piano in the middle with Dominique de Meniel. And as she did, she invited Renzo Piano over to stay with her in the Philip Johnson house, and they obviously hit it off over discussions over the kitchen table in her house in River Oaks. As Piano remembers the discussion, it was about art, light, intensity of emotion. He describes how she came to us with very clear ideas about the form her creation should take. I mean, another issue which is very obvious is they're all pretty strong-minded as clients. She wanted nothing to do with the rhetorical modernity of downtown Houston. What she wanted was an experimental museum, one that would function simultaneously as a restoration centre, exhibition site, and village. She had a great love of light. She wanted us to work with the theme of natural illumination. This is exactly what Piano did, producing a beautiful but deliberately low-key set of spaces, with storage on site, no shop or cafe, beautifully day-lit galleries, and a sense of close connection with the natural world outside. So this is a picture of Renzo Piano, and on the left is Peter Rice, who was a British engineer surveying the galleries with Dominique de Meniel in the background. Next. Here's one of Piano's drawings, which demonstrates how much care he put into the filtering and quality of daylight in the gallery. And a lot of the sort of interest of all this group of collectors was in the quality of daylight. Here we see the outside of the gallery, low-key, single-story, deliberately undemonstrative. Not unlike, obviously, Marine's, the house by Philip Johnson, and this is a picture of the gallery spaces inside. I haven't been recently and am keen to go back. Now, I could, of course, go on. There's a long history of private museums and galleries in Germany, in America, also in Japan, and now particularly in China. François Pinault has just opened the Bourse de Commerce in Paris as a private museum. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, is going to open a gallery to show his collection of narrative art in Los Angeles, they say next year. James Dyson is planning a private gallery at Doddington Park in Gloucestershire. In my book, I also included accounts of the Byler Museum outside Basel, wonderful place if you haven't been, and the Susch Museum in a remote part of Switzerland. What I wanted to do this morning is not to provide a comprehensive narrative of all the private galleries in different countries, but instead to concentrate on those ones which I regard as key in establishing what has become an international movement across the world. Those which establish the pattern which others have followed. Above all, Louisiana, which many private collectors want to copy because of the quality of its collection and the beauty of its setting. Also, Catholicism, which I think has been very important in retaining a sense of intimacy and an essentially domestic setting. And in the United States, obviously the Meniel collection is the model of a private museum. These were all collectors who did not want their collection to be simply absorbed into the impersonality of a public institution. They wanted to retain a sense of the separateness and specialness of their collection as they themselves had wanted it to be shown and enjoyed. Not, as I've said, in a didactic way, but as something to be absorbed and experienced visually, somewhere where it might be able to appreciate art aesthetically as they themselves had experienced it. as a private and personal experience of art, and not as a more impersonal public one. I think they're admirable examples of people who wanted to make the private experience of art public, examples of museums which have been followed all over the world. Thank you. So now I'm very happy to answer any questions, either about the ones I've talked about or indeed ones I haven't talked about, assuming that I know something about them. So, any questions?
Charles, I've recently discovered Dutch private museums. Have you any experience? I came back last weekend from Museum of Belvedere in Friesland.
No, funny enough, I know there's one somewhere between Amsterdam and Groningen where, again, very characteristic of these sorts of people, an industrialist, made money, collected figurative art. Maybe this is the one you're talking about. Okay, no, I haven't been to it. It was in Apollo. I mean, I haven't been anywhere for the last 2 years, so I'm rather out of date in my museum visiting and having got out of the habit. Anyway, so I think, well, I'd be really interested. He's interested in more figurative art, as I understand it. And of course, museums now tend not to be interested in figurative art. It's very much this sense of people wanting to do things in their own way and do things differently from the way if they simply got absorbed in a public institution. So, Robert, tell us about it. Good.
Well, I think the one you're thinking of is in fact another one that
Yeah.
is comparable. It's called Museum Mall, which
Okay.
shows an exhibition of you and Hugo's work.
That's it.
Pre-COVID.
Yeah.
Probably
Yeah.
the best exhibition of Hugo I've ever seen, ever.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
that good.
He bought a town hall.
Yes,
This guy.
added a modern extension to
Right.
it, along the lines exactly those principles you
Okay,
described.
yeah.
It is fascinating.
And the other one you mentioned.
The other one is Museum Belvedere, which has just opened an exhibition for Barbara Hepworth. It's called Living the Landscape. Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nixon, and the St. Ives artist.
Okay.
And its particular interest is in the influence of landscape and nature on artists and how they respond to that.
Okay. And there are probably others.
There are.
Yeah.
I visited a couple not long ago. They have a lovely house in a relatively suburban area outside La Haye.
Yeah.
And in the garden, they've built a private museum that is mostly underground, 3 stories underground. It's not open to the public. It's just for their own satisfaction.
Okay. Yeah. And plenty of German industrialists, I think, have done the same, where it's this sort of, you collect so much that you can't accommodate it in your house, but you want to keep control of the way it's displayed, but also make it to an extent publicly available. And I suspect, I don't know, I don't know about Dutch and German tax law, but there probably are tax benefits if it's publicly accessible. And then the question of public accessibility is, Kettle's Yard was very publicly accessible. Jim Eade obviously really liked and wanted people to come in freely, but it's still undergraduates. It's not, it's probably 10,000 people a year rather than 1 million. Yeah, one of the good things about doing this is I will no doubt discover others which I should. Actually, Maya, who helps Nicola here, has a website called the Art Pilgrim, which has lots of these private museums. I mean, there are quite a lot of them in the south of France, for versions of the same reasons. French people, yeah.
Where's your personal favourite art
Okay, so I suppose one of the reasons I included Catholicism is that I was a student there. In fact, I think I went in, when I went as a student in September 72, and I think that I could have invented this memory, that Jimmy was still around, but I didn't know anything about him as a person. But I certainly borrowed works, and he left a bursary fund. When they were raising money for Catholicism, the then director very astutely went through all the people. I got £75 when I graduated in order to travel around Europe, which Jimmy had given. And so I got a begging letter saying, please will you contribute? I also have rather fond memories of Heidi, which is another, I suppose my book was very much about big public collections. But I think, like everybody, one tends to be fond of and have a slightly different relationship with smaller institutions which are a bit more personal. And that's why I'm very admiring of what Nicola has done here. This doesn't pretend to be a huge, great retrospective of Auerbach. It's just a selection of works, including works from the Tate, and it's more intimate. You see them in a different way. You can absorb them differently from the experience of a big public institution. And it's not to invalidate the experience of a big institution, but I think one wants a complicated ecology in the way the art world operates. And I think these private institutions are an important part of that ecology.
Can I ask Charles, leading on from that, the architectural space, the environmental and facilities management of any gallery or museum dictates so much in terms of what art can be exhibited and everything else. And I think certainly one of the objectives here was to try not to have a forbidding environment, to create, since this is a domestic building, or was originally, and has lots of quirky little rooms and squeaky floorboards that aren't even, and it was to try to sort of take away that fear factor. Do you feel that looking at private museums around the world, that is being achieved? Are new audiences being engaged by private galleries as well as public museums? Is that something that is increasing? Are more people engaged with that, or are they still forbidding but in a different way?
Well, let me talk about my experience of here first, which I found interesting, because I've been 2 or 3 times since Nicola opened it. And I found it interesting how the space has subtly, probably significantly, but adapted to being a space for the display of art. I found coming to see this exhibition very, very satisfying, because when I first came, it still had sort of the residue of being a council building. And it takes time, I think, for a space to adapt. It takes time. The truth is, I think, for people to learn how to use spaces. Actually, I didn't talk about, but I've been up two or three times recently to Bishop Auckland, which is this amazing project up in an ex-mining town near Durham. And basically what happened was Jonathan Ruffer, who has made a lot of money, was offered a collection of paintings by Thorburn, which was owned by the Church of England and had been housed since the 1740s in the Bishop's Palace at Bishop's Auckland. Bishop's Auckland is where the residence of the Bishops of Durham is. And actually they were offered to the National Gallery when I was at the National Gallery, and I can't figure out quite why we didn't pay more attention to them, except at the time we were trying to buy the Madonna of the Pinks. Somebody very sensibly suggested Jonathan might be interested in helping, which indeed he did. And then the Church of England said, well, if you're going to buy the paintings, do you want to buy the palace? and by then he was sort of committed. So he's bought this huge, rather wonderful, fascinating Bishop's Palace. And what made me think of it is this issue of how you convert a building which was not founded for the display of art into somewhere which has a sense of being an approach, which is kind of not too domestic. It lost all its furniture, and I think the reality is it takes time, to learn about the configuration of spaces. So that's to do with the spaces. In terms of audiences, the honest answer is that if you think of the Sainsbury collection at the University of East Anglia, it's definitely, I hope, successful in giving students an idea of living with art. But if you're thinking of it in terms of broader audiences, it's frankly hell to get to because it's on the university campus and it's at the bottom end of the university campus and there's probably one bus a day. It's not a conveniently accessible place, and that would be true of, I think, quite a lot of these private institutions. They're not really geared towards what you would regard as a broad public. The question, what's my favourite? One of my favourite places is this island off the coast of Japan, Naoshima. And a lot of it is about how difficult it is to get to, because once you've got there, you focus on the art in a different way. It's like, I haven't been recently to Orkney, where I've forgotten the name of the museum set up in the post-war period, where you have a different experience, I think, because you're staying there. It's not London. It's somewhere where you're in a different environment, and I think that is a lot of the motivation behind these. It's not to have a mass democratic audience. It's to give people an opportunity to spend time with works of art in a more considered way. Yeah.
I was just going to say that last year went to Lisbon, and I think this was a private collection. Well, it was a private collection within it. It was the Jardin Calouste Gulbenkian.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing which I'd say that Louisiana is my favourite museum ever.
Yeah.
It's so weird to get to because it's blooming difficult.
Yeah.
And everybody's walking to get to this place and you've no idea where you're going to. This was a very different experience, but one of my favourite, which is you're going around somebody's collection, which is sort of a public bit, and it's extraordinary how different. It's a bit like Sainsbury's one. He collected the most amazing coins, and then this fantastic. And I love seeing somebody's collection all together, and you think, wow, what were they thinking when they bought this, and why did they go down? So it is a really inspiring way to see
actually,
something.
Gulbenkian really belongs in this group because he was an oil billionaire. He was spectacularly rich, and he lived in Paris before the Second World War, and Kenneth Clark made friends with him. In terms of the relationship between public institutions and private galleries, Kenneth Clark made friends with him. And I think like a lot of them, he was quite difficult. There's an exhibition at the moment, which I haven't seen in Paris, about him. and kind of made friends with him. And where the Sainsbury wing now is, was going to be the Catholicism Museum. And then, very unhelpfully, the British government said that he was an enemy alien in 1941. And at which point he decided not to give his collection to the National Gallery, and he migrated from Paris to a hotel in Lisbon. And then in the 60s, he left not only his collection but his fortune to the Portuguese government. And I mean, actually, it's another one, if I were ever to do another edition of the book. But funny enough, when I had been to it previously, I think that's where one tastes kind of, well, certainly my taste is somewhat changed. When I first went to it, some of it is actually by Leslie Martin. A lot of it is by 3 Italian architects. And it is very much of this generation of post-war museums. But when I went to it recently, after I delivered the book, they had a very good exhibition about display techniques in the post-war period, and so I went out. And actually I went round. I mean, it encouraged you to go round and study how well considered it was, the relationship to the outside. It has an inner courtyard, so a lot of this generation of people who established museum were very interested in looking at art, but also refreshing the mind by looking outside. It's a kind of nature art. Yeah, and it has very beautiful gardens, and it's in a suburb of Lisbon. I'd strongly recommend it.
You don't mention Hauser and Wirth, right? Which is an interesting.
Yes, as Nicola does. I'm a great admirer of what Hauser and Wirth have done at Bruton, and it is, in a way, it's still a commercial art gallery because everything's for sale. But for those, if you haven't been there, I strongly recommend it. I mean, actually, the person who asked me about what I thought he should do, I said, have you been to Hauser and Wirth? And he had. And I said, you should go, because it has a beautiful garden. They got, I think, a very interesting, he was Argentinian designer, and it's very well into, I mean, basically, as I understand it, they were encouraged by this town to buy what was an old farmhouse, sort of semi-derelict farmhouse, and they wanted to kind of support the community. So they bought the farmhouse, and then they built the gallery, and then they did the garden, and then they opened the restaurant. Now they bought a lot of the town. And I think it's very interesting as a project. It's sort of, well, it's relevant to what Nicola's doing here, of how you change an urban community through what you do within the community, for the community, and how that's perceived. It's very equivalent to Bishop Auckland, except that kind of getting people interested in contemporary art in Bruton is probably an easier task than getting people interested in Spanish Baroque art in a ex-mining community in County Durham. So.
Well, Charles, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. I mean, I really recommend Charles's book. It's a fabulous read. Charles has very kindly signed many of the books downstairs, so if anyone were interested to pick up a book, I would heartily recommend it. Charles, thank you so much indeed.